Greetings and salutations, travelers of the internet. Welcome to the Lit Round Table. I'm Anna.
And I'm Joseph. We'll be your wise or not so wise mentors for today's audio adventure into all things storytelling. Welcome back, y'all. It's been a while for us.
It has! Man, how long has it been?
Well, it is February 1st right now. We recorded the last one was in August, so it's been a hot second.
But well worth the wait.
For us, anyway.
Yeah.
Yes. We wanted to start this in 2021, and here we are. First, before we get into today's topic, we mentioned in a previous podcast that we'd be reading a book together to kind of go over and review towards the end once we've actually finished reading it.
We're going to go through
kind of section by section each week while we're reading it also.
Just touch base.
And then at the end we'll kind of have a review thing for the whole book overall. But that book is The Lies of Locke Lamora by Scott Lynch. And that is the first book in the Gentleman Bastard series. So if you guys, anyone listening, would like to follow along with us, next week we'll be going over the Prologue and Chapter 1. That's where we'll be for next week.
I know that doesn't sound like very much, but the chapters are quite long.
Yeah, they're lengthy.
So it's not like we're going to be talking about 10 pages. We're
right.
talking like 60 pages.
Right. Yeah, it'll be a pretty decent chunk of pages for that. So, but yeah. So the once again, The Lies of Locke Lamora is the book by Scott Lynch. Get it on Audible. Get the paper copy, however you want to do it. The Prologue and Chapter 1 before next week, and just
and
warning,
by next week we mean 2 weeks.
Oh, sorry, not next week. I mean the next podcast.
Yeah.
My bad. Maybe someday we'll be able to do these every week. That'd be cool.
That would be
maybe
cool.
Someday. But also, just a heads up, in case you do want to read along with us, it is an adult novel, not a YA novel. There are some more adult themes and more adult language in this one. If you're easily offended by crude language or anything like that, maybe skip this one. Just from reading the prologue in Chapter 1, I mean, it hasn't felt really gratuitous at all because, I mean, just the plot of the book is, these are thieves, professional thieves that live in the criminal underground of this fantasy city, this fantasy setting. So it makes sense. Like, I've never been like, oh, why did they use that word? But because
right.
it does make sense for who they are as characters. But just a heads up, if that makes you uncomfortable, maybe skip this one. But yeah, so that's The Lies of Locke Lamora. And then we are also just doing our own stuff on our own, which we're going to go over. Some updates with what we've been reading or games we've been playing and that kind of stuff. So, Anna, you want to start with what you've been doing?
Sure. So, I am a chronic let's read many books all at once.
Yeah, you are.
But I have made some really impressive leaps and bounds in my reading this last weekend. So, I have been going through The Magician's Nephew, which is the chronologically first book in the Chronicles of Narnia, which I'm reading through with as a book club with a bunch of middle grade readers, which has been fantastic. I love it.
Super cool.
It's so fun, and these kids are just wicked smart, and I just adore the insights they bring to the table. It's so good. Mm-hmm. But so we're having our final meeting on that this week. So I finished that book this weekend, and then I also finished one of my Star Wars Legends books, which I'm really excited about. Which I took a long time to read, mostly because I was just reading a chapter before bed. But I finished that up this weekend. I also recently finished the Selection series by Kiera Cass, which I listened to on Audible. That was super good. I powerhoused through those. They're a YA series. And now I'm listening to the second book of the Red Queen series by Victoria Aveyard. And that's been really good. And I'm also working on A Gathering of Shadows by V.E. Schwab. I think that's the name that one's written under. She has a couple different pen names depending on what she's writing. But anyway, that's been really good too. So I'm reading a lot.
Yeah.
The moral of the story, Anna's reading a lot of books.
More than me.
But I've gotten a couple of them off of my currently reading list, so it's feeling a little more manageable now that I've finished a couple of them.
Sure.
And of course, I'm always reading the Silmarillion until I get it done, which I don't think I've read any more of it since the last time we recorded. Except that I read a
Oops.
chapter last night that was very short. So but I am still trying to work away at that. So
There you go.
yeah, so that's my reading life at the moment.
Awesome.
Lots of variety.
Yeah. So for me, I did finally finish the first book of the Wheel of Time series, Eye of the World. It's pretty big. They're all pretty decent size. So now I moved on to book 2, which is The Great Hunt, and it's great so far. But since I'm normally not the person that reads multiple books at once, I'd be lying if I said reading Lies of Locke Lamora will not interfere.
Oh.
So.
Oh yeah, I'm also reading that book.
Yeah. So hopefully not too much though, but it might slow me down a little bit on Wheel of Time. But yeah, those books are also just they're sizable.
Yeah.
So they're not the fastest reads anyway. Plus Robert Jordan uses really flowery language, and which I should be used to anyway because of reading Tolkien, but it's
different though.
It's still they're still different authors and they have different prose and all that stuff. But
I do feel like I should interject and say that most of the books that I'm reading and getting through very quickly are YA. So it's a very different reading level than Wheel of Time would be. Or even Lies of Locke Lamora. So
yeah, for sure. So that's kind of what we've been up to lately. Oh, and as far as games go, I'm, not too many updates there with what I've been playing video games wise. Still need to beat Ghost of Tsushima, which is a travesty that I haven't. But I've been way too into Persona 5 lately. So I'm actually replaying that game for the second time.
I don't know what that is.
Instead of playing the game that I need to finish, I'm just playing another game that I like again, which is a problem with gamers. But whatever, it's fine.
But before you move on from games, we're also doing an RPG together right now. That
is true. We are playing an RPG that I'm the DM. Well, for this game, it's called the Lore Master, so LM. But it's the One Ring RPG. It takes place after the events of The Hobbit and before the events of the Fellowship of the Ring. And we are currently playing through the Tales of Wilderland source book with some of those adventures, and we're going to do the Darkening of Mirkwood. And I have all the source books now, so hopefully we can kind of veer off and do some other adventures in some other areas, and I'm really excited about it. So if you've ever played that game, it's really fun. And it's currently in kind of limbo. You can't really buy it right now, or you can, but it'll be really expensive because they're actually out of print because the game kind of changed hands with developers. But I believe someone somewhere is working on a second edition of the game.
That's cool. I didn't know that.
So that's exciting. So we'll see what comes out of that. Hopefully it'll be cool. But yeah, that's really fun. I think we're on the 5th session this coming Monday.
I think that's right.
So yeah, we're 5 sessions in. It's been real fun.
Yeah.
So without further ado, we'll move on to today's topic of discussion in all things storytelling, which is genre fiction.
I'm nervous about this one.
I know you are. So basically we're gonna be talking about what is genre fiction, what are the different genres, which are our favorites. You could probably guess, we could probably guess each other's, but
I think that's pretty obvious.
Yeah.
Based on episode 0.
We'll still talk about it. We'll talk about it anyway. And we're also going to spill some of the tea regarding genre fiction versus lit fiction, literary fiction, the epic battle. There's apparently some contention between the two camps, which I say contention. There's one camp that wants to be taken more seriously, and yeah.
I mean, this makes me so nervous.
We'll get there.
I think that anyone who has dabbled in the publishing world or in academics, English circles, will know the basis of this. But I also made it through my entire undergrad and had no clue. So
yeah, I didn't know until fairly recently, a year or so ago. I was like, oh, there's a
thing here.
There's some kind of rivalry here, and I was not aware of this. But anyway, we'll get there. But first, we are going to just start off by just defining what genre fiction is for you guys, and then we'll just kind of let the discussion take off from there, talking about what the different genres are, which ones we like, and all that. So I have the definition of genre fiction pulled up. So genre fiction, also known as popular fiction, is a term used in the book trade for fictional works written with the intent of fitting into a specific literary genre in order to appeal to readers and fans already familiar with that genre. That is from Wikipedia.
Good.
So, yeah,
I think
you
that's
can.
fairly accurate.
That was the literally what comes up if you Google genre fiction. Just the first thing.
Yeah.
And yeah, and then there's the different types of genre fiction, which are just the different genres. The ones that are listed here are crime, fantasy, romance, science fiction, western, inspirational, historical fiction, and horror. But there are other subgenres also that you can kind of branch off into. Really, the first thing that I thought of just from reading the definition of like just any kind of fictional work that caters to a pre-existing audience that is already familiar with like source materials and stuff. Mm-hmm. The first thing I thought of was how we are just being totally inundated with superhero movies.
Oh yeah.
It's like, oh yeah, so that's kind of like superhero movies are kind of like the cinema world's genre fiction kind of thing.
Sure.
Where there's, and that's something that I kind of encountered in film school with just going around the instructor asking what your favorite movie is, and there'd people be like, oh, Citizen Kane, or ooh, A Clockwork Orange, which I'm like, ew, why is that your favorite movie? But ooh, yeah. Okay, if it's your favorite movie, whatever, that's fine. But like
but why that one?
Why do you like feeling icky? But and then it circles to me, and I'm like, Lord of the Rings. Uh-huh. Yeah, so that it's just kind of interesting how these things tend to travel between mediums, regardless of, this isn't limited to just books, but that's kind of the main focus of what we're going to be talking about. Yeah. Since you've kind of got experience in this area, but yeah, so
yeah, I think that probably would follow into any kind of storytelling mm-hmm. medium. Like I think you probably would see that in video games too. It'd just be different.
Oh yeah.
Just because there are different, it's like mainstream versus
mm-hmm.
like indie games, you know. But yeah, it is interesting to see how it is all kind of cyclical in that way.
Yeah.
And you just see it come up over and over again.
For sure. But yeah, so yeah, it is interesting to see how just the kind of genre fiction beast just permeates all fiction, not just books.
Right.
But for today's purposes, we're mostly focusing on books. But you know, it still applies to like movies and games and that kind of thing, mm-hmm. as far as like what our favorite genres are, because what your favorite genre isn't really limited to just the mode of storytelling. You know, right. It's your favorite genre all around. So I would definitely say that my favorite genre is fantasy, and I'm assuming that's yours as well.
Yes.
But you know, sci-fi gets an honorable mention because of all the Star Wars books that you've read, but you can still argue that Star Wars is fantasy.
Yes, I don't read, because I've read some like truly science fiction novels through my MFA program, and they are not like Star Wars novels at all.
It's not like your favorite book is Dune.
No, I have not read Dune.
I started it, and it was difficult.
Yeah, it's one of those that I need to read because it's like kind of a pillar of mm-hmm. speculative fiction. But
I do want to read it. I will get to it. It's on my shelf.
Yeah.
But yeah, and one of the reasons why fantasy appeals so much to me specifically, I was actually watching a video from Brandon Sanderson, who's a pretty big fantasy author right now. He told this story about how he was doing a book signing, and the mother of one of his fans came up to him and just asked him like, hey, I don't mean to be offensive or anything, but I just don't get it. Like, why are you guys so into this stuff? It's not realistic. It doesn't make any sense. Why are you so into it? And so he talks about how he kind of went into this moment of contemplation of like, yeah, why fantasy? Like, why fantasy in particular? Why is it that people are so into fantasy? And then he eventually says that he just landed on why not fantasy? Because, you know, fantasy can still have any other genre within it. You can still have fantasy stories that have romance, or that have, romance, horror, crime, heist, mystery. You know, you have all of these different genres that can still be fantasy. As soon as you add a fantastical element to a story, you have a hard time convincing someone that if there's a dragon in it, it's not a fantasy book.
Or time travel, or...
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. As soon as you add something like that into it, supernatural forces, it's a fantasy story. So, and it really, to me, that just amplifies the story. I don't see it as like oh, that's not realistic anymore. That disconnects me. I'm not into this. I see it as like that's a really interesting idea. And I wonder what it would be like if that is how it was in real life. And it just enhances the story for me. It doesn't take away from it.
Yeah, same. No, fantasy is hands down my favorite genre. Although I do, like, I have read, I don't know, I feel like there's a lot of things that I've read that I'm like, well, that was technically a romance, but it was still a fantasy because of X, Y, and Z reasons. So a lot of what you're saying. I have recently learned that I do not like memoir.
Oh, yeah. Tell us about that.
I would not have said that memoir was my favorite genre to begin with anyway. Like, I generally don't gravitate towards biographies or autobiographies unless I'm doing, like, some kind of research on a specific author. I would say the only author that I really have enjoyed doing any kind of biographical research on would be Tolkien or Lewis.
Fair.
But for this book club that I'm a part of through a church group, which generally speaking, they pick books that I do not normally pick for myself, like genres that I wouldn't pick,
Which can be healthy.
which has been really good. Like I've encountered some books that I would have never read, except for that book club, which I think is a really great use of a book club, honestly. But for January, the book choice was, I don't know, do I want to call out the book? I think so. It's like a bestseller. It has sold like millions of copies, which is just bizarre to me.
Hey man, we might have some hot takes here that other people don't agree with. Some people love it, but it's fine if you don't. So you can call the book out.
Right. I generally get nervous about calling books out because as wanting to be an aspiring writer, but it just was not my cup of tea.
I wouldn't call yourself an aspiring writer.
Well,
you're a writer,
but
aspiring
not
published writer.
Yes. But so it's All Creatures Great and Small, I think is what it was called, by, oh my gosh, what was that guy's name? Started with a J. Hold on.
Stand by.
Pause.
For the name of the author.
Okay, All Creatures Great and Small by James Herriot. It was written in 1972, so it's an old one.
Oh, okay.
But it's a memoir.
I thought it was recent.
No, it's an old one. And the first, so I listen to most of the books that I read for book club. This book club, not my younger group book club that I'm leading. But I generally listen to the ladies' book club. And the first chapter of this book is a very graphic description of a bad calving.
Ugh.
Which, we're from the Midwest. We've heard plenty of stories from our dad about...
Yeah, our dad grew up on a farm.
Calving or castrating pigs. Like, you just hear all kinds of stories that
Scooping
are
the chicken poop.
not that fun. And so when I read a book, that is not what I want to read about.
Yeah.
And I thought, well, maybe this is just like the author's way of like grabbing the reader's attention, and it'll get better. But it just was more of that.
They went for shock value to catch your attention, and then they just kept going.
Yeah.
Just a weird medical thing after medical thing.
Yeah. So, and I've never heard, it was narrated by I think it was a Scottish narrator. And so they talked about urine a lot because it's a vet memoir.
Sure.
But the narrator kept pronouncing it urine. And I was like, I just can't. So
Wait, people in Europe pronounce urine?
He had a very specific accent. So I think it was his accent.
Oh, okay.
But I don't know.
That was a stupid thing for me to say because they probably have a altogether different word for urine. But it was...
Well, urine is urine.
Well,
It's
I mean, like in another language.
Oh, yeah. But I mean, it was spelled the same. It is a book written in English, but it's about an Englishman.
Yeah, I guess what I mean to say is, like, wait, do people in England
accent.
pronounce urine? But anyway.
Yeah, anyway.
That's neither here nor there.
No, not important at all. But it was just like, I think I got in, like, 5 chapters and then was finally like, no, I can't finish this. I just can't. And so maybe it does turn into a very heartwarming story, but by chapter 5, I just don't have time for that kind of book right now. You heard all my other books I'm reading and enjoying.
Yeah.
And 2 of those were, the one that we're reading, and then for another book club. So,
yeah, I get
that
it.
I'm leading. So it's not an optional thing.
Yeah, I get it.
But, yeah, all that to say, my favorite genre is fantasy.
So has this ruined memoirs for you?
Probably. But like I said, it's not something I gravitated towards anyway. So I don't feel like a loss.
That's fair. That's fair enough.
So, but yeah, it's just super weird. And I mentioned it to one of the ladies in the book club, and she was like, oh, I loved it. And I was like, I do not understand.
It's like me and wine. Like, I'm always trying to figure out why or how someone can like wine.
Sure.
Because I'm like, this doesn't taste good to me. I guess I grew up with like fruit juice and soda and stuff. So like maybe I'm just expecting it to be really sweet and then it's not and I'm disappointed. But I'm just like always convinced that there's this weird conspiracy where people don't actually like wine, but they just say they do to make themselves look more sophisticated. So maybe that's what's happening with your book club. Everyone hates it, but everyone's too afraid to say anything because it'll make them look less sophisticated.
Well,
I guess maybe.
I don't think,
it's possible.
But I suppose it's possible, but I don't think so. I don't think these ladies are that conniving.
I mean, people surprise you, man.
It's true, but that would really surprise me. But some of them listen to this, so. Hey, ladies.
Sorry,
I didn't
Samantha,
like the book.
I didn't mean to call you out. No, I don't think there's even a Samantha in the group. But, or is there?
I don't think so.
Okay, good.
And I'm sorry if there
creepy.
is. I don't think there is.
Oh, well, whatever.
But it's just funny.
So that's a genre. Okay, so what is it called when, like, there's a term for it when you decide to not finish a book? What's it called?
Oh, DNF. Did not finish.
So you DNF'd the memoir.
I did.
Okay.
I did.
That's fair. Which
I've been trying to do a better job of tracking my books on Goodreads and rating them so that I can get recommendations from Goodreads. And I had to create a folder for DNF books. And it's the only one I've done it to.
There you go.
Which is funny because there are other books that I have not finished, but the reason I did not finish them was because I was listening to them and I thought, oh, this book will be better if I read it. Which, to be perfectly honest, and we'll get into this in the next podcast, but I did that with Lies of Locke Lamora. So I don't want to get too far into that. But there are some books that are just better geared to listening versus reading or vice versa.
Sure.
So not all books are created equal for audiobooks. So.
Yeah, that's interesting. We'll have to get into that more when we talk about Lies of Locke Lamora next time. But yeah. For me, if there's a genre that I can't stand, I haven't really found it yet. Although I did discover, this is kind of a whole different topic, just as like just how you structure or write your book. I got a book for Christmas. It's the first book in the Dresden Files by Jim Butcher. It's called Stormfront, I think. It's kind of a modern set fantasy series about a guy that's like a wizard, but also a detective and like solving crimes. But I didn't realize that it was in first person until after I got it. And I haven't read a first person book since I read the Maximum Ride books in middle school by James Patterson. I think they are.
Huh, I didn't remember that.
So I'm super not used to reading first person.
It does take some adjusting.
So I'm curious to see how that'll go. But as far as like a specific genre, I don't know if there's a genre that I would just loathe to read. Even romance. I mean, I read all the Twilight books.
Yes, you did. Yes, you did. Do you want... Okay, so you mentioning first person. I hate writing in first person. I am not good at it.
Yeah.
Which is one of the things that like we had to practice. And I think I weaseled my way out of all those assignments one way or another because
Nice.
I am not good at it and I do not enjoy it and it just makes writing painful for me. So when I encounter a book that is written in first person and is written well, I'm like, oh my gosh, how do you do it? How do you do it?
There's like appreciation.
Yes,
for the craftsmanship.
Yes, because it's hard. I think. I
Sure.
get caught up in like tense issues when I write in first person. Like, am I writing in present tense? Am I writing in past tense? And then I just get too in my head about it, and I just
I feel like third
do not
person
do
is
it well.
definitely the easiest to write in.
It's the most common.
Or
For
yeah,
sure.
I should say that most common. It depends on the writer.
Yeah.
But because I feel like if I were to write something in first person, it would just turn into me kind of journaling and just word vomiting onto the page.
That's what my first person is.
Yeah.
That's the only time that I write first person, I should say, is when I'm journaling.
Sure.
Because I am not good at it.
Yeah.
When it comes to fiction. But the first, like, I don't want to say it's the very first person novel that I ever read, but when I was going through my Star Wars novel,
yeah. I know which one you're going to talk about.
I, Jedi, which I did not realize was written in first person until I started reading it. And which by the title I should have known, but in my defense, I was a middle schooler.
Sure.
So,
Can't really fault you.
no, but it's like one of my favorite Star Wars novels.
Sure.
And it's the one that I'm most excited about rereading, I think.
Oh, cool.
So
That's cool. We'll have to maybe devote another podcast to just the different
oh, for sure. There's so much there.
because also we haven't even talked about there's first person, third person, and there's second person. What the heck is second person?
Garbage. No, it's not. It's just so different.
So jarring.
Yes.
We'll talk about that in a future podcast.
I think I have one. I'll have to look and see if I can find
really?
it. Yeah, I think so.
You'll have to show it to me later. But yeah, we'll talk about that in a future podcast. But anyway, we digress. Back to genre fiction.
It's not actually garbage. I just want to. I'm just kidding. About second.
She's not kidding.
No. I am.
Second person's trash. You heard it here first.
No.
Quote, Anna Schuett, 2021, second person's trash.
No. Anna definitely can't write that and has a lot of respect for people that can. But Anna also does not enjoy reading it.
She's also referring to herself in the third person, which is
only right now.
Really goes to show her preferred writing style. All right.
Oh my gosh.
Back to genre fiction. So yeah, I don't really have a genre that I hate or despise. I'm willing to try anything really. I think
that's fair.
I'd probably be least likely to try a Western.
Oh.
But the second era of the Mistborn series, which I love the first era of Mistborn, the second era is kind of a Western era. I think that having a Western with magic in it could definitely flip me on whether or not I like Western books or not. I've never read a Western book. I've seen tons of Western movies, and I've played Western games. Red Dead Redemption 2 is awesome, but never a book. So we'll see.
So we had a whole unit on Westerns in my grad program because we took like half a semester or a whole semester for each subgenre, like of the big ones. So we had a semester on romance. We had one on Westerns. Speculative fiction, so that was like sci-fi and fantasy. And we had one on, what am I missing? Oh my gosh.
Horror?
We had one on horror.
Historical?
Yes.
Crime?
That's what I was thinking of. Crime.
I have the list in front of me, so I was able to just
I
pick
was
them
looking
out.
at my titles because I have a whole shelf on my bookshelf that's just grad school books, and so I was like, well, which category does Holmes on the Range fall under? Holmes on the Range is a spaghetti western.
I was gonna say that sounds pretty.
And we also read True Grit. Like some of the westerns that we read, I actually enjoyed a lot compared to like the romances we read, but to defend the romance genre, the ones that we read were intentionally not good. Because you can learn a lot from things that are not good. Yeah. But I am not going to call those books out.
Yeah, that's okay.
But
they serve a purpose.
They served a purpose, a really good purpose. So now when I read like a good romance novel, I'm like, oh, this is so good.
And you can read a book and get hooked on it and realize like, this is not good, and in no way should I model any real life relationships off of what I'm reading right now.
Oh, no.
And that the same thing goes for Twilight, because while I have read all of those Twilight books, except for the newest one that's like from Edward's perspective or whatever, I haven't read that. But
I haven't either.
I did read Once Upon a Time. I did read all the Twilight novels, and they are not like those relationships are not good relationships, generally speaking. But you can still enjoy something and realize that I should not idealize this,
Right.
But, and I really only use Twilight as an example because I think that's a really cool example of how romance and fantasy intertwine because of the whole vampire werewolf thing.
But that's also under the whole umbrella of YA, which is kind of its own.
Oh, those are YA,
too.
aren't they?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, I guess I read them while I was a young adult, so I guess.
Yeah. Forgot.
I was like, oh yeah. If I read them again, I'd probably be like, oh yeah, this is a YA book. But
yeah.
But anyway, so now let's move on to the area that you're most nervous to talk about.
You can't see this, podcast listener, but I just shifted in my chair very uncomfortably.
I'm so eager because I love it. We're gonna spill the tea. I'm super excited.
It's not even really tea.
I know. I'm like hyping this up way too much.
Yeah.
Making it sound like you had some crazy falling out with the professor or something. No. Which no. But there is some
not even close.
There's some slight tension. I'll say tension.
Okay.
Between genre fiction and literary fiction or litfic. How would you define literary fiction, like compared to genre fiction?
So,
I guess I'll look it up too. We'll see. I'll quiz you. What's litfic, Anna?
So my understanding, and the way I keep the two separate, genre fiction and literary fiction are more, because you can have a novel that's a romance that is literary fiction. It's more like the way that they're written. Literary fiction is more about what is the reader going to take away from this, whereas genre fiction is more about how is the reader going to escape into this.
Okay.
Am I on the right track based on what you just looked up on Wikipedia?
Right. So again, this is Wikipedia. Here's the definition. Literary fiction is a term used in the book trade to distinguish novels that are regarded as having literary merit from most commercial or genre fiction. However, the boundaries are not fixed, and the serious study of genre fiction has developed within academia in recent decades.
Yes. So, that segues good into...
That segues good.
That segues well
You're
into
a writer.
My experience, which is obviously grew up reading genre fiction.
Yeah.
I did not know that genre fiction as an umbrella category was a thing.
Oh, me neither.
Like I just thought fiction is the umbrella category, and under fiction you have like realistic fiction, which I think is probably more commonly known as literary fiction.
That's what it is in my mind, anyway.
And then you've got your science fiction, your fantasy, crime, horror, whatever else.
Yeah.
So that's how my frame of reference worked, because that's how it's organized in the library.
Right.
Like if you go to a library, they don't have literary fiction, genre fiction, and then in genre fiction all the other categories. It's just under fiction or nonfiction.
They have fiction, nonfiction, and then fantasy sci-fi. Fantasy sci-fi gets pushed off in the corner sometimes.
Sometimes.
Next to the manga.
Not always. Not always.
And the comic books.
That might be a more recent thing as fantasy.
Which
and
honestly,
sci-fi
I'm fine with it, because then I don't have to weed through the boring books to get to the books that I like.
Right.
That's harsh. They're not boring.
They're really not.
I'm revealing my hand, which I prefer. But yeah, literary...
There is something to be said about books being organized in a way that's easy for the reader to find if the reader is looking for a specific type of book, and books like it.
Absolutely.
So there's a lot of thought and science that goes into like the way libraries and bookstores are set up, and it's fascinating. But all that to say, I did not know that there was a difference between literary and genre fiction. I made it all the way through my undergrad program and didn't realize there was a difference.
Impressive.
Yeah, well, I took survey classes that, like, I had a Shakespeare class. So we read all the not all of the Shakespeare plays, but a lot of Shakespeare plays. And I took a Brit Lit 1 class. So, that's like, you're reading really old British literature because it's from a certain, like, time period of British literature. Sure. Mostly classics until I got into the YA class, and then in that class we had more recent things because YA is a fairly new genre that's being developed. There wasn't YA novels back when Jane Austen was writing.
Gotcha.
So in that regard, it didn't come up in my undergrad because it just wasn't part of the coursework where it could organically come up.
Yeah.
When I was working on my grad school applications, because my original intention was finish undergrad and go right into grad school, not take a year off. So that first year when I was applying, I had one of my, he wasn't my professor, but he worked in the writing center, and I also worked in the writing center. He was like the head of that department. And he offered to like read some of my submissions for grad school. So I had him read the submission that I had put together, and in my packet I had included an excerpt. Wow, that's a word that doesn't sound like a word right now.
Yeah, it's weird when that happens, isn't it? I had someone yesterday at work try to ask me if they had spelled the word sold correctly, SOLD.
Oh.
And they were like, it doesn't look right. I know it's right, but it doesn't look right. And I was like, yeah, that sucks, doesn't it? Yeah. I hate it when that happens.
Yeah. Anyway,
Random, sorry.
So I had this selection from some writing that I had done included in this packet. And he gave it back to me and he said, and the selection I had picked was very clearly a fantasy. And he said, well, which schools are you applying to? And what programs are you applying to? And I was like, I'm applying to this creative writing program at this school. A couple different schools, actually. Some like really well-known creative writing schools. Uh-huh. So you figure that out. And he said, they are looking for literary fiction and you have genre fiction here. And I was like, what are you talking about? And he was like, well, they're going to want something that is more realistic. They're not going to be looking for fantasy. Not that there's anything wrong with you wanting to write fantasy at all, but just so you're aware, their submission like team is not going to probably look at this and take it seriously, which was a shock to the system. Like I had never heard of that before. I didn't know that was a thing. I didn't get into any of the grad schools that I applied to the first time, which is fine. I wasn't ready. Mm-hmm. And the things that I turned in with the submission packets were not my best writing because it wasn't writing that I cared about.
You kind of embarrassed to look back and
some of the
stuff you submitted.
That's a whole other thing. But that first round, like I submitted things that I had written for classes in my undergrad, which were not bad writing, but I did have some issues with some of my professors for my writing courses. And I did like intentionally write some things that I thought would tick them off.
I want to hear more about that.
No.
Someday.
Maybe someday.
Not on a podcast. Because I've never heard of that.
No, we can talk about that sometime on the podcast because I do think it's a valuable lesson in how we teach writers the difference between active and passive voice. But it is a story, so we can save it for. So
okay.
Stick around. Maybe you'll hear about how I got super ticked off at one of my professors, and I still have classmates that will comment on how they were surprised at how ticked off I got. Oh my gosh. So so that submission process was really challenging, and it wasn't until my second round of applications to grad schools that I was like, I'm going to look and see if there are any grad schools that actually have genre fiction programs, because that's what I want to do. I don't want to go to school for creative writing and only learn how to do literary fiction when that is not my interest.
Yeah.
I also applied to some like literature programs, which is different than a writing program. And I got into one of those, but ultimately went with the writing program. So, which I'm grateful for. Although I would be lying if I said that it hadn't crossed my mind to like go back and do a literature degree, because I do, as much as I do not want any more student debt, I do miss academia and like the way we talk about writing and reading and literature, which this is helping fulfill that. Like
it's intellectually engaging, you know.
Yeah,
I agree. Yeah, so as far as once you did start applying to grad school programs and you got into a writing program, are you going to say where?
Oh, I've already said where I went to grad school. I went to Western State, Colorado University.
Right. I know we said that in episode 0, but just for the context of this conversation.
I thought you were asking, do you want to say where you went to school? Like, you're going to out yourself? Yeah. No, I don't care. People can know that. Yeah. It was a great program. Yeah, so
it was a writing program where they were okay. Were they like just okay with genre fiction, or was it like all about genre fiction?
All about genre fiction.
That's cool.
Yeah, no, it was awesome. I learned a ton. that was another experience where they made me read things that I would not have picked for myself. Like, I've read 2 Stephen King novels now, and I do not like horror, but I've read them.
That's a question that I meant to bring up before. So for horror, is it possible for a horror book to be literary fiction? Because sometimes if it's a horror, there's no fantastical elements if it's just like about a serial killer. So could that just be literary fiction? Or is all horror kind of lumped into genre fiction? Well, I guess even if it doesn't have fantastical elements, that just makes it fantasy, I suppose. So
I would say, in general, horror is part of genre fiction.
Okay.
However, if you're asking if there are examples of literature that would be considered literary, I think that you could probably make the argument that Jekyll and Hyde is literary horror.
Interesting.
Or even Frankenstein, because those novels are written about monsters, but they do have very intentional, like, allegorical elements to them that I think probably puts them in the literary fiction bracket.
Yeah, because they're more about, like, exploring the human psyche and, like, the monster within, you know?
But they're freaky.
Oh, yeah. And, like, Dracula, the original.
Yeah. So, but those are, like, classic horror, and which is another interesting topic when you talk about classics, because I think classics automatically get put under literary fiction, mostly because of their age, and because they're little time capsules for their time periods. Like Jane Austen, those are romance novels. But I think you could easily argue that they're also literary.
Oh, yeah. When I think literary fiction, like Jane Austen is honestly the first name that pops in my head.
Yeah.
Or like Moby Dick or To Kill a Mockingbird.
Moby Dick.
You know, those are what pops in my head when I think of literary fiction.
But there's modern literary fiction currently being written that are not classics.
Yeah.
But they also fall into that bracket. Sure. So it's easy to pull those as examples, mostly because those are probably the most literary fiction that I've read.
Yeah. So I guess as far as what we touched on before about there being some contention, it seems like there are people that are in the hardcore literary fiction sphere that kind of treat genre fiction like it's lesser or not as quality writing, which I think people that do that are lumping all genre fiction into the same boat, and they're thinking about the romance novels where someone cranks out like 20 romance novels a year, and
hey,
but it's still a novel, and it's
an incredibly valid genre.
Yeah.
I don't read a lot of romance novels in general, but I have a lot of respect for the writers who can do it well, because it's so formulaic, and the readers know if you're not a romance writer. So you have to be good at it, and it is a very specific skill, and I have a lot of respect for those writers.
So I guess what I'm saying is, it seems like a lot of the lit fic people, there is kind of an air of superiority.
Yeah.
So is that something that...
Honestly, I think that's probably driven mostly by academics.
Okay.
Like, I don't know that, which is probably where the contention actually lies. So if you're talking to just like an avid reader, most of what they're reading is going to be popular fiction, probably, which is genre fiction.
Right.
There's
Popular fiction and genre fiction are usually interchangeable.
Yeah. People that read a lot of books are looking for new books.
Yeah.
Quickly. So the books that get studied in academia or writing that gets studied tend to be classics or books about the human condition, or, some of that you have to think about it and digest it kind of writing.
Yeah.
And so I think that's where a lot of the contention lies. It's like everyday reader versus scholarly reader.
Yeah. Which is kind of aggravating, just because genre fiction and fantasy have that same potential.
Oh.
And I think if you eliminate the bias going in, you can read a fantasy book that will hit you just as hard, if not harder, than like a literary fiction book. And they both can dive into like social issues, like
Listen.
racism and sexism and like religion, and they handle such a wide swath of issues.
Listen,
And
I don't mean to interrupt you, but I read Tolkien and did an independent study of The Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit in my undergrad. And I read those books like they were scholarly literary fiction.
Mm-hmm.
And I got so much out of them that way. And so I would fight anyone on Tolkien being technically
just throwing hands.
I'm just saying, I was like, Tolkien is obviously like considered the father of fantasy. He has left a huge impact on how the fantasy genre currently operates, to its benefit or detriment. We could argue that, but it is literary fiction, and I think that a lot of genre writers would also agree that it's in kind of a different echelon of story than what you're seeing a lot of like contemporary fantasy as.
Yeah,
because
that's
it's in the classic bracket as well.
Mm-hmm.
But there's a lot of examples of that though, where you're reading something and you go, oh, this is talking about war, or this is talking about industrialism and, you know, climate issues. Like there's a lot of that stuff that comes up in fantasy, and especially speculative fiction. Like science fiction is built on the idea a lot of the time that we have depleted the earth.
Yeah.
And it sent us off into space. So there's a lot of contention there that doesn't need to be there. And it's not as prevalent as... you can avoid it. You can easily avoid it.
Yeah, I mean, the clickbaity thing to do would be to like title this like...
I'm not going to call it Spilling the Tea.
Okay, good.
I'll probably call it Return of Genre Fiction.
Even though it never really left.
Right. I don't know. I'll figure it out.
Maybe if you dive deep into the history of genre fiction, maybe there have been dry spells, but I don't think we're in one. Especially
we're not in one.
I think we're kind of in a golden age right now of genre fiction, actually.
Yeah,
with the prevalence that shows like Game of Thrones brought to the table, all of a sudden everyone was interested in fantasy again, you know.
Mm-hmm.
Writers like Brandon Sanderson, Wheel of Time, Robert Jordan, although he is deceased now, his work is definitely going to last. So I think there's a ton of genre fiction stuff to explore.
Ooh, genre fiction news.
Yes.
I saw this week that Margaret Weiss and Tracy Hickman are going to re-enter Dungeons, and that's not the name of it. They're going to re-enter the Dragonlance world.
Oh.
And
wait, is that the Here There Be Dragons people? What are those?
The what?
Here There Be Dragons or something?
No. Dragonlance are the series of D&D novels that I... it's not D&D, but it is D&D.
Right.
That I read kind of synonymously with Star Wars novels.
Oh,
Not
okay.
synonymously. What is the word?
Alongside?
Yeah.
At the same time as?
Yeah.
When you were reading the Star Wars novels?
Yes.
Okay.
And their like Dragons of Autumn Twilight series was one of the first Dragonlance series that I wrote. So when that came up on my Twitter feed this week, I was like, oh my gosh, I'm so excited for Dragonlance.
Dragonlance.
And then I had to go back and be like,
Dragonlance.
I wish I owned those books. So my birthday wish list has some Dragonlance novels on them now.
That's cool.
Books that I've already read, but they were like
That's cool.
books that I really enjoyed. I would like to read them again. I think I would get more out of them now.
Yeah.
Anyway, that's some news in
That's cool.
fantasy world.
Yeah, that'll be exciting.
I know.
Yeah, and I think something that genre fiction has, going back a little bit, and kind of segueing into the next podcast, something that genre fiction has that literary fiction, I think, can have but struggles with more, is escapism.
Well, I think it's intention. So it's not the intention of literary fiction to be escapism.
Yeah, because, I mean, when you're reading a literary fiction book like To Kill a Mockingbird or something, it's so real.
Mm-hmm.
It's so, like, it's so realistic and could most definitely happen and does happen that you can't disconnect. And, you know, sometimes, especially when you have a year like 2020, you need to just get out.
Yeah.
So, and that I think is a strength of genre fiction, and it's one of its main purposes, And escapism is going to be the topic of our next podcast.
Yeah.
So that's kind of a nice segue into that. And yeah, we're going to talk about stuff like whether or not it's healthy, where do you draw the line, all that good stuff. So yeah, be looking out for that. But do you have anything else you really want to add about the genre fiction topic before we sign off for this one?
Read what you want to read, man.
Yeah, that's what it boils down to.
Yeah.
If you like lit fic, that's awesome. If you like genre fiction, that's awesome. Just read whatever makes you happy.
And don't be a gatekeeper. Gatekeeping is bad. Doesn't help anybody.
Yeah,
So.
It's just a way to make yourself feel entitled, and it's dumb. So,
yeah.
Alrighty. Well, I think that's going to do it for this episode of the Lit Round Table. Thanks for joining us. Once again, be sure, if you would like to follow along with us through the Lies of Locke Lamora, pick that up, and we'll be going through the Prologue and Chapter 1 in the next podcast. But until then, go read something cool. We'll see you next time.
Bye-bye.